Something was watching from the bottom of that well, and it had been waiting for a very, very long time. Nobody in the small town of Harlow Creek talked about the old well on Miller's property. Not anymore. Not since what happened to the Greer kids back in 1987. Not since the sheriff found boot prints leading toward it but never leading away. And definitely not since old Earl Miller himself stopped sleeping at night, started nailing boards across his windows, and whispered to his pastor on his deathbed that something down in that well had looked back at him, something with eyes. You're watching the Fear Sermon, and tonight we are going somewhere dark, somewhere deep. So if you're the kind of person who needs the lights on to sleep, you might want to flip that switch right now. Because this story doesn't end the way you think it does. It doesn't end with a logical explanation. It doesn't end with someone saying, "Oh, it was just an animal," or "Oh, it was just the wind." It ends with a question. And that question is going to stay with you long after this video is over. If this kind of storytelling keeps you up at night in the best possible way, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the Fear Sermon, because we do this every single week and you do not want to miss what's coming. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Harlow Creek was the kind of small American town that looked perfect on a postcard. Population just under 4,000. One diner, one gas station, a church with a cracked bell that still rang every Sunday morning, and roads so quiet you could hear the crickets having full conversations at night. People left their doors unlocked. Kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. But every town has a wound. Something it carries quietly, something the older residents remember but don't discuss, something that gets buried under decades of normalcy and small talk and casseroles at church potlucks. In Harlow Creek, that wound had a name. Everyone called it the Miller Well. The well itself was old. Older than the Miller family's farmhouse. Older, some said, than the town itself. It sat about 200 yards behind the main house, surrounded by a circle of dead grass that never seemed to grow back no matter what season it was. The stones around its rim were dark with age, worn smooth in places where hands had gripped them over generations. A wooden cover, warped and splitting, had been placed over the top sometime in the early 70s, but everyone who'd ever lifted that cover said the same thing. They said you couldn't see the bottom, not because it was too dark, because it felt like the darkness was pushing back. Earl Miller inherited the property from his father in 1971. He was 34 years old, newly married, cautiously optimistic about the future. His wife, Donna, loved the farmhouse. She loved the wide porch and the old oak tree in the front yard, and the way the sunsets looked from the kitchen window. What she did not love was the well. She told Earl on their very first night in that house that something about it made her stomach hurt. She couldn't explain it. She said it was like standing too close to the edge of something and feeling the pull. Earl laughed it off. He was a practical man, a farmer. He didn't believe in feelings that couldn't be explained. That changed in the spring of 1974. Earl had gone out to check on the back pasture after a storm rolled through. It was early morning, maybe 5:30, the sky still that deep blue-gray color it gets before the sun decides to fully commit. He had his flashlight, his boots, and a thermos of coffee. He wasn't thinking about the well. He was thinking about whether the fence posts had held overnight, and whether he'd need to call someone about the drainage on the east side of the property. He passed the well without even glancing at it, but then he stopped because he heard something. It was soft, almost like breathing, a slow, rhythmic sound rising up from somewhere below. Earl stood very still. He told himself it was the wind moving through the underground water table, or maybe an animal that had fallen in, though the cover had been on for years. He walked back toward the well slowly. He put his hand on the wooden cover. He felt it then, a vibration. Faint but steady, like a pulse. Earl lifted the cover. He shone his flashlight down into the darkness. And something blinked. He dropped the cover and ran. He didn't stop running until he was back inside the house with the door locked behind him. Donna found him sitting at the kitchen table, white as a sheet, his thermos on the floor where he'd dropped it, coffee spreading across the linoleum like a dark stain. She asked him what happened. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I don't know what's in that well, but it knows we're here." From that day forward, Earl Miller changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small and steady ways that the people who loved him noticed. He stopped going out after dark unless he absolutely had to. He began checking the locks on the doors multiple times each night. He never walked near the well again, not for any reason, and he told Donna and later their children that if they ever felt curious about it, if they ever felt drawn to it, they needed to come get him immediately. Don't go near it alone, don't look down into it, don't touch it, just come get me. The Greer kids didn't listen. Tommy Greer was 12 in the summer of 1987. His sister Angela was 10. They lived on the neighboring property, and like most kids in small towns with too much summer and not enough supervision, they roamed. They knew about the Miller well the way all the kids in Harlow Creek knew about it. It was a dare, a legend, a thing you talked about at sleepovers to see who would scream first. Tommy had been building up to it all summer. He told his friends he was going to look into the well and prove there was nothing down there. He told Angela she could come if she promised not to cry. Earl Miller was in town that afternoon. Donna was visiting her sister 2 counties over. The property was empty. Tommy and Angela crossed the fence line at around 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. It was hot. Kind of hot that makes the air shimmer over the fields and turns everything a little bit golden and hazy. They walked through the tall grass toward the back of the property. Angela said later, in the years she spent trying to describe what happened, that the well seemed farther away than it should have been. Like no matter how long they walked, it stayed the same distance, and then suddenly it was right in front of them. Tommy grabbed the wooden cover. It was heavy, but it moved. He slid it to the side, just enough to lean over and look in. Angela stood a few feet behind him. She said she didn't want to look. She said she had a feeling. Tommy leaned over the rim. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Tommy screamed. Not the kind of scream you make when something jumps out at you. Not the kind of scream you make when you're startled. Angela said it was the kind of scream that comes from somewhere deeper than fear. A sound she had never heard from a human being before and has never heard since. Tommy stumbled backward away from the well, fell down in the dead grass, scrambled to his feet and ran. He ran past Angela without even looking at her. He ran all the way back across the fence line, across his own yard, and into his house where his mother found him under his bed, rocking back and forth, repeating the same phrase over and over. It looked at me, it looked at me, it looked at me. Angela never looked into the well. But she told everyone who asked that in the moment between Tommy screaming and Tommy running, in that small slice of silence, she had heard something. Coming from the well, not a voice exactly, more like the memory of a voice, a low, resonant sound that she felt in her chest more than she heard with her ears. Like something very old was trying to remember how to speak. Tommy Greer didn't talk about what he saw for 11 years. He went through most of middle school and all of high school in a kind of quiet that his parents called withdrawn, and his teachers called troubled, and his friends called just Tommy being Tommy. He graduated, moved away, came back at 23 when his father got sick, and one night sitting in his childhood kitchen with a cup of coffee and the particular honesty that comes at 2 in the morning, he told his mother what he had seen at the bottom of that well. He said it wasn't an animal. He said it wasn't a reflection. He said it was a face, but not a human face. Something that had the shape of a face the way a mask has the shape of a face. The proportions were almost right, but not quite. The eyes were what he remembered most. They didn't glow. He was very specific about this. They didn't glow like eyes in a horror movie. They just caught the light like eyes do, like something that had been sitting in the dark for a very long time and had learned, over that very long time, how to look. His mother held his hand across the kitchen table and didn't say a word until he was done. Then she told him something she had never told anyone. She told him that the summer before, while he and Angela were at camp, she had heard sounds coming from the direction of the Miller property in the middle of the night. A low, rhythmic knocking, like something tapping against stone from below. She had told herself it was pipes. Old plumbing settling in the heat. She had told herself that for 12 years. Earl Miller died in March of 2003. He was 66 years old and had lived in that farmhouse for his entire adult life. In his final weeks, confined to a hospital bed that the family had set up in the living room because he didn't want to die somewhere with fluorescent lights and strangers, he spoke often about, well, not always coherently, not always in ways his family could follow. But the pastor who came to sit with him, a man named Reverend Caleb Howe, who has since spoken publicly about what he witnessed, said that Earl was lucid enough on his last full day of life to have a clear and deliberate conversation. Earl told the Reverend that the well was a door, not a metaphor, not the rambling of a dying man's fading mind. He was specific and calm, and he looked the Reverend directly in the eyes when he said it. He said, "There is something on the other side of that well that has been trying to come through for a long time." He said, "I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's one thing or many things or something that doesn't have a number." He said, "I kept people away from it because I could feel what it wanted. It wanted someone to keep looking. It wanted someone to lean over the edge and stare down long enough that the looking would go both ways. That's how it gets through the looking." Reverend Howe asked him what would happen if it got through. Earl closed his eyes and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know, but I know it's been waiting longer than we've been alive. And I know it's patient. And I know that patience like that comes from being very, very sure that eventually it's going to get what it wants." Earl Miller died the next morning just before sunrise. His daughter, Patris, inherited the property. She was 41, practical, a high school science teacher in a town 2 hours away. She came to deal with the estate with the full intention of selling the land as quickly and cleanly as possible. She had not grown up afraid of the well because Earl had shielded his children from the worst of it, giving them just enough warning to stay away without giving them enough information to be genuinely haunted. Patris knew the well was off limits. She didn't know why in any specific detail. She thought her father had been eccentric. She thought small towns generated small myths. She lasted 4 days on the property before she called her brother in a voice he described as completely unlike her normal voice and told him she needed him to come immediately. What happened in those 4 days, Patris has only discussed in pieces over the years, never in one complete telling, as if the full story is something she can only approach from angles. But here is what is known. On the first night she heard the knocking, she described it the same way Tommy's mother had described it. Low, rhythmic, coming from the direction of the back pasture. On the second day, she found the wooden cover of the well had moved. Just slightly, a few inches. She told herself the storm the previous night had done it. She put it back. On the third night, she woke up at 3 in the morning and was standing at the back door of the farmhouse without any memory of walking there. Her hand was on the door handle. The door was unlocked. She was looking out the window toward the dark shape of the well in the moonlight. She said she didn't feel afraid in that moment. She felt like she was supposed to keep walking, like something was expecting her. She went back to bed and lay there with every light in the room on until morning. On the 4th day, she called her brother. The property sat empty for 6 years after that. Nobody wanted to buy it. The farmhouse slowly did what farmhouses do when nobody loves them. The well remained, the dead circle of grass around it remained, and the cover, which Patris's brother had nailed shut with 12-inch spikes before he left, remained nailed shut. Until 2009, when a man named Daniel Cross bought the property. Daniel was 38, recently divorced, a civil engineer who had moved back to the general region to be closer to his aging parents. He had no connection to Harlow Creek specifically. He found the Miller property through a listing that described it as a fixer-upper with significant acreage at a surprisingly low price point. He was not from there. He had not grown up with the stories. He had not sat at kitchen tables hearing the warnings passed down in careful, quiet voices. He was exactly the kind of person the well had been waiting for. His neighbors tried to tell him, not everything, not all at once, because that's not how these warnings work in small towns. They come in pieces, a comment here, a suggestion there. Old Marge Hensley from down the road brought him a casserole and mentioned sort of casually that the well in the back hadn't been used in years and probably shouldn't be opened up. The man at the hardware store, when Daniel mentioned he was fixing up the Miller property, got very quiet and said, "You leave that well alone, son," and then changed the subject. Even Reverend Howe, now retired and well into his 80s, made a point of stopping by the property one afternoon and asking Daniel, gently but seriously, if he had any plans for the structure in the back pasture. Daniel was polite to all of them. He was also completely certain they were being superstitious. He was an engineer. He believed in load-bearing walls and drainage coefficients, and the kind of reality you could measure with instruments. He pulled the spikes out of the well cover on a Saturday morning in October with a claw hammer and a clear conscience. He said later that he wasn't even planning to look in. He just wanted to see if the structure was sound, if it was a hazard that needed to be filled in, if there was any historical significance to it that might affect his renovation plans. He was being practical. He lifted the cover. He looked in. He didn't scream the way Tommy Greer had screamed. He went very quiet. His neighbor, a farmer named Pete Schultz, who had been watching from his truck, parked on the road with a clear sightline to the back of the property because he had been nervous ever since Daniel moved in, said that Daniel stood at the edge of that well for almost 4 minutes without moving. Just looking down, Pete said he got out of his truck and started walking toward the property because something about the stillness of it was wrong. He said it didn't look like a man examining a structure. It looked like a man who had forgotten where he was. Pete called Daniel's name when he was about 50 yards away. Daniel didn't respond. Pete called again, louder. Daniel blinked, turned around, looked at Pete with an expression Pete described as someone waking up in the middle of a sentence. Confused, a little lost, and then just regular, like a switch had been flipped back to normal. Daniel said he was fine. He put the cover back on the well. He went inside and made lunch. Pete went home feeling unsettled in a way he couldn't fully articulate. That night, Daniel Cross started writing in a journal. He had never kept a journal before in his life. He wrote in it every single night for the next 4 months, and after what happened when his sister came to collect his things from the farmhouse, she found it on the nightstand and brought it to the sheriff, and eventually, with certain sections redacted for reasons that were never clearly explained, portions of it were shared with a local journalist who has since moved out of state. The journal entries from the first few weeks were normal enough: renovation notes, lists of materials, observations about the property, but starting about 3 weeks in, something shifted. The entries got shorter. The handwriting, which had started out neat and deliberate, became increasingly cramped and hurried. And certain phrases began to repeat. It is still there. Something is still there. I can hear it at night, but only if I hold my breath. I went to the window again at 3. I don't remember going to the window. I feel like I'm being watched from below. Not from the well specifically, from below. Like whatever is down there can see upward through the ground. The last entry in the journal was dated a Thursday in late February. It was a single sentence. It said, "I understand now what it wants." And then below that, in different ink, as if written at a different time, a different hand, almost 2 more words, "It's me." Daniel Cross was found 3 days later by Pete Schultz, who had gone over to check on him after not seeing any activity on the property for several days. He was sitting in the kitchen. He was physically unharmed. He was completely unresponsive. He sat there without reacting to anything Pete said or did, staring at a fixed point on the wall, breathing steadily, eyes open, for 22 hours before the medical team that eventually arrived was able to bring him back to something approaching responsiveness. He was diagnosed with a severe dissociative episode. He spent 8 weeks in a psychiatric facility. He never moved back to the Miller property. He never, to anyone's knowledge, spoke about what happened during those 3 days. What he had seen, where he had gone, in whatever sense the word gone can apply to a man who never left a kitchen. The property was abandoned again. It is still abandoned. As of today, the farmhouse is collapsing slowly into itself. The oak tree in the front yard is still standing. The well is still there. The cover is still on it, though nobody knows anymore whether it's nailed down or just resting. The circle of dead grass around it has, according to satellite imagery and the accounts of 2 local teenagers who got close enough on a dare last summer to take photographs before turning and running, not shrunk or grown. It is exactly the same size it has always been. One of those teenagers, a girl named Rosie who has since talked about the experience on a local podcast dedicated to regional folklore and unexplained events, said that she got within about 10 feet of the well before she stopped. She said she stopped because she felt it. Not a sound, not a sight, a feeling. She said it was like standing in front of a door and feeling the air pressure change because something on the other side is very close, right on the other side of the wood, breathing. She said she looked at the cover and the cover was still, completely still, no wind, no movement. She said she felt, and this is her word, recognized. Like something down there knew she was standing there, not in a threatening way, in a patient way, in the way you feel recognized by something that has been expecting you. She turned around and walked back to the road. She didn't run. She said running felt wrong. She said running would have felt like an answer to something she didn't want to answer. Now, here is the part that I need you to sit with for a moment, because everything I've told you up to this point, as unsettling as it is, still has the shape of a local legend. A haunted well, a spooked farmer, children who saw something they couldn't explain, a man who lost himself for 3 days. You can file this under rural mythology. You can tell yourself that small towns need their monsters the way all communities need their cautionary tales. You can do that, but here's what you can't explain away quite so easily. There are 14 documented locations across the continental United States with a nearly identical profile. A well or a shaft or a pit or a cistern that is older than the surrounding structures. A consistent circle of dead or discolored vegetation around the opening. A history of livestock avoiding the area in a way that defies normal behavioral explanation. Reports, always from multiple independent sources who did not know each other, of low rhythmic sounds at night. Reports of people being found in states of dissociation after spending extended time near the location. And in every single one of these 14 locations, without exception, there is the same detail in the historical record. The same detail that connects them across decades and geography. At some point, someone looked in and reported that something looked back. In Harrow County, Alabama, 1931. In a town outside Flagstaff, Arizona, 1958. In rural Pennsylvania, 1974. In a farm community in upstate New York, 1989. In a small Oregon township, 2001. The dates span a century. The locations are thousands of miles apart. The people involved had no connection to each other. The language they used to describe what they saw, separated by time and distance and culture, is almost identical. Something with eyes, something very old, something patient. Researchers who study these cases, and there are a handful of them, academics who work carefully and quietly and do not particularly want the attention that comes with this kind of subject, have a term for the phenomenon. They call it a witness point. The theory, and it is a theory, is that certain locations function as observation positions, points from which something that exists outside our normal understanding of space and presence can see into our world. The well is not where it lives, the well is where it watches from, and the watching, according to this theory, is not passive. It is a form of contact. When you look in and see it looking back, something has passed between you. An acknowledgement, a connection, and that connection, once made, does not sever cleanly when you walk away. Earl Miller understood this. It took him years of living with something he couldn't name, but he understood it. Keep people away. Don't let the looking go both ways, because the thing that wants to come through is not trying to force its way in. It's waiting for an invitation, and an invitation in its language is an act of attention. Every person who has looked into a location like the Miller Well and come away changed was not attacked. They were not grabbed or haunted in the traditional sense. They were noticed. And being noticed by something like that, something that old, something that patient, something that has been sitting at the bottom of a dark shaft waiting for someone to look long enough, leaves a mark that modern medicine can diagnose but cannot fully explain. Think about that. Think about the specificity of it. It doesn't need to do anything dramatic. It doesn't need to climb out. It just needs you to look. And most of us, when we encounter something strange and dark and inexplicable, do exactly that. We look, we lean in, we want to see more clearly. That impulse, that very human need to understand what we're looking at, that's the mechanism. That's the door. And somewhere in the back pasture of an abandoned property in Harlow Creek, behind a warped wooden cover held down by nothing and no one, at the bottom of a well that goes deeper than any well should go, something is waiting for the next person who decides they're brave enough or curious enough or practical enough to lean over the edge and see for themselves. It's not in a hurry. It has never been in a hurry. It has been there longer than the property, longer than the town, longer, perhaps, than the language we would need to describe it accurately. And when you go home tonight, when the house is quiet and the lights are off and you're lying in that specific dark that exists at 2 or 3 in the morning when sleep won't come and your mind starts to wander into places you don't invite it, I want you to think about what Earl Miller said on his deathbed, that the patience of something like that comes from being very sure that eventually it will get what it wants. And then I want you to think about Rosie, standing 10 feet from the well in the afternoon sunlight and feeling recognized. Not threatened, not afraid in that primal animal way, just recognized, like it already knew she was coming, like it had already accounted for her. Like her presence, standing there on that dead grass with her phone in her hand and her heart beating a little faster than normal, was already part of a plan that had been forming since before she was born. She felt that, and she turned around and walked back to the road. The question you need to ask yourself, the one that's going to follow you into sleep tonight, is not what is at the bottom of the well. That question doesn't have an answer that language can carry cleanly. The question is this: if you were standing there in that dead circle of grass, in the afternoon quiet, feeling the weight of something very old pointing its attention at you from below, would you be able to walk away? Or would you do what humans always do when faced with a darkness they can't explain? Would you lean in just a little bit more? That is where the fear sermon leaves you tonight. Not with a resolution. Not with a cleanup crew and an explanation and a nice tidy ending. With a door that is still open, with something that is still waiting. With the knowledge that 14 locations exist right now in this country, silent and ordinary, looking from the outside, with something patient and old sitting at the bottom of them, watching the light change overhead, season after season, year after year, waiting for the right person to look down at exactly the right moment. And the knowledge that right person might not mean the bravest person or the most reckless person. It might just mean the next person. If this story settled into your chest in that particular way, the way that good fear does when it's attached to something that feels real, leave a comment below and tell me what part of this got to you. Tell me what you'd do if you were standing at that well. Tell me if you've ever been somewhere that felt like it was watching you back. Share this with someone who thinks they don't scare easily, because those are always the most satisfying people to test. The Fear Sermon is here every week with stories that live in the part of your brain that doesn't fully quiet down at night. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time, because what we have coming next will make tonight feel like a war. Mup, sleep well if you can.